So now we're going to transition to Nikolai Barka, who will be presenting on low tolerance, a hypothetical approach to managing ungulates at acceptable levels in native ecosystems beyond fences.
All right, does it look good? Can you hear me?
It's good.
All right, I don't need to repeat the title. So my name is Nikolai Barka with the Nature Conservancy, and thank you for coming to my presentation. Aloha, everybody. So I'll give you a little bit of background on myself. I grew up hunting, and that brought me into contact with native plants, which I developed a passion for growing those native plants, and that kind of led me down the road to college and eventually a job. I got a job with the Nature Conservancy. So I got to give thanks to Trey Menard and John Fafford and Sarah Newton for hiring me back in the day. I've been with TNC for 15 years now, managing watersheds. So I like to say I'm not a beginner anymore. I'm also currently standing as the Kauai rep on the state's Game Management Advisory Commission. So if anybody wants to talk about game animals with me, it's one of my favorite topics. But let's get back to my day job here. So Kauai has feral pigs, feral goats, and we're the only island in Hawaii with black-tailed deer. We do not have axis deer. These animals, they're a wonderful resource, but they can also be problematic in ways, which is why we remove them from our fences to protect the native ecology and watersheds. So here's a map. The green is a mapping of native forests on Kauai. And the other colors are either existing or proposed fence units. And we fence as much native forest as we realistically can. But one thing that's never sat well with me, and I suppose it probably hasn't sat well with a lot of people, is that a lot of native forest has no plans for fencing, probably 2/3 of it. And a lot of those areas, they tend to be more accessible to the community. They're also managed as public hunting units. And there's some overlap between native forests. So here's some overlap between native forests and hunting units. And I always looked at that overlap as places where it's an opportunity where the hunting community and conservationists could come together towards a common goal, protecting the native forest. But nobody seems to quite know how to do that. And so let's review the problem. It's expected that by 2030, only 30% of the native forests might be protected with fences. There's no clear plans on how to protect the other 2/3, at least not in the immediate future. So fencing, it's a limited solution. It's expensive. The animal control doesn't fully end. Like, you still have ingress. They can be controversial. And then as you get downhill of our Kauai fences, like, the forest tends to get more weedy. And sometimes the game animals can be controlling weeds. So like we see on Kauai, we see deer controlling karaka nut and blackberry. So you might want some number of animals on the landscape to control certain weeds in certain places. We know the ungulates can make a difference, and that fences allow native forests to recover. And fences are the gold standard for watershed protection. So this is in the East Alakai fence on Kauai. Here you can see native plants outcompeting invasive grasses after animal removal. And this is another striking example of a splenium fern and some effects of black-tailed deer browsing along the Halehaha fence. And so, like, we know zero animals works to protect the native forest, but from this same fence, we know that recovery actually occurred before we got all the deer out. Like, there's still deer in that unit. And so that brings up the question, like, what is the animal level that results in forest recovery? And can we measure it? And can we manage for it? And so these are questions that run through my mind a lot. And it was at one of these conservation conferences that I was first introduced to the concept of a Kobe plot, which is used in fisheries management. So here's one example. So in the Kobe plot, there's an x-axis, it has fish biomass, some kind of fish biomass metric. And then on the y-axis is a fishing pressure metric, and it shows the relationship between the two over time. So it shows the status of a fishery over time and its current trajectory. And some of them are able to tease this from commercial catch reports, which I think is pretty amazing. So it has quadrants. The green quadrant represents a state where there's no overfishing and it's not overfished. That's where you want it to be. Above that is overfishing / not, but it's not yet overfished. And then to the left of that is overfishing / overfished. You don't want to be there. And then below that if the dot were to fall into there, it'd be there is overfishing, but it's possibly rebuilding. And so here's another variance where it's used to describe a common fishery story, whereas like when a fishery begins, the data point for that year would start in the lower right-hand green area, representing a healthy stock. And as fishing increases, it can eventually cross that threshold where overfishing can occur, which would then drive the point to the left into the overfish state. And that's like a classic overfishing scenario. And now we've had more time for these things to play out around the world, and we have examples where we know where like through some sort of intervention or change, or fishing effort is somehow reduced below that threshold again, and that allows stocks to recover somewhat. So think of like cod in the Atlantic. So some of you might be asking, like, why is this guy talking about fisheries? I thought this was supposed to be about forests. Well, because if you swap fishing with browsing and you swap fish biomass with plant biomass, it starts to look a lot like the story of the Hawaiian forest. So inspired by the Kobe plot, and maybe if this catches on, we can call it an Alakai plot, since I'm about to use it with data from the Alakai. And also, Alakai, get it? Guide, leader. Anyway. This is the story of the native forest. When animals were introduced, be it cattle, sheep, pigs, deer, etc., their population grew, eventually crossing that threshold and causing overbrowsing, which in turn decreased the vegetative cover, which drives the data point to the left. And the higher the animal population, the faster to the left that point will go. And eventually it can lead to what is a degradation curve with a lower carrying capacity. And the goal of conservation has generally been to reduce the ungulate numbers within a fence to below the threshold, and to as low as possible, which allows vegetation to increase to whatever it wants to be or should be. And we call this a recovery curve. And those fence units, they do provide a valuable baseline for what an adjacent unfenced forest could or should look like if the animal numbers were managed at the right level. So whereas like if public hunting did reduce animal numbers below the threshold, and then vegetation would improve, albeit probably slower than with zero animals. And if it improved to a vegetation metric that is similar to within a nearby fence, like could that be a mark of success? Like it's not zero tolerance, but we'd have to make up some other term. But I think we should emphasize like having a target goal for both animals and vegetation and managing for that. So some caveats here, like this is just a theoretical model. We don't know the magic number where these thresholds are yet. The thresholds, they should be different at every site. But like using a plot like this, maybe I think we could define those numbers. So let's try this with some real data. So let's use some data from our East Alakai fence here in Kauai. So we have both the back calculated pig population as well as long-term vegetation monitoring. And out of all the things the pigs ate, it seems they really liked hapu. And they would just hammer hapu as soon as the little ones formed to form. And hapu is what we saw the most dramatic increase with. And so like, perhaps hapu can be a proxy for overall forest health. If the hapu is doing okay, maybe everything else is doing okay too. So let's see what happens when we plot hapu leaf cover against pig density over time. And I'll be darned, it worked. We got what we expected. So we reduced the pigs. It seems to have crossed that threshold where hapu could grow faster than they could eat it, which drove recovery. And so there's some limitations here. Like it gives us some idea where the threshold was. It doesn't tell us yet how far to the right hapu will go. It doesn't really tell us yet what abundance of pigs the forest can now sustain before overbrowsing would occur again. My hunch is that it's higher than it used to be. It's got a higher carrying capacity. But we should be able to test for those numbers over time with the right data. And so, if we did do something like this to protect the remaining 70% of native forests, we would need vegetation monitoring both inside and outside the fences. We would need to monitor animal numbers, and we need to work together with the hunting community towards a common goal. Because hey, hunters want healthy habitat too. And I know working with hunters has been difficult, especially in extremely remote areas, and I haven't addressed rare plants at all. But hey, that's why we still get fences. And in the slightly less remote areas, I think there's some underutilized solutions, such as like encouraging harvesting of female animals, especially if population control is needed. And there's places in the US where they have like earn a buck programs where like you have to shoot a doe in order to receive a buck tag. So, and we definitely need more legal camping sites. Like imagine if there was like hunter shelters, which would both improve the hunting experience and keep hunters coming back for more, even if the animal numbers dip. And that's like Trey's old idea. I think he got it from Billy DaCosta back in the day. And we could all use these shelters, not just hunters. So anyway, thanks for listening, and I hope this presentation drives some discussion. And with that, mahalo to our friends and partners. Any questions, comments?
Thank you, Nikolai. We have someone in the Q&A. Can public hunters keep levels of ungulates low enough to meet that threshold? Or would public hunting need to be supplemented?
Yeah, supplementing is a possibility in some places. I mean, imagine if you had the math done and you knew that like you needed X 100 days to, with that success rate that they have in that unit, to catch X many animals, and you kind of had some idea of that and they fell short, like you could supplemental hunt it, yeah.
Hapu'u seems good for pigs as an indicator. What about for deer?
Deer, total different, mostly a different suite of species they're eating in our fence units. So like the pigs like the ho'io fern, the hapu'u, the Ethereum fern. The deer also like the Ethereum fern, so that was the overlap. And then the deer also like the Carnival, Olapa. They like the Olapa the most of anything, and several other species. So there are different suites of plants. So we're measuring those plants now to see if we can measure a difference over time and test these different densities and see what kind of effects they're having on that forest.
We got the questions pouring in. Yeah, why not address rare flora's needs?
I have some ideas on how to do that. I just couldn't fit it into this presentation. I was trying to keep it simple. More discussions. We should have more discussions on that.
Yeah, and we will have time at the end of the presentations in this session. We have another one. Where would the funding come from for all the monitoring needed? I also saw a comment, I think from JB, that the shelters would be cheaper than fences. So that's an interest. Maybe we'll combine those two. Where would the funding come from for all the monitoring needed?
Excellent question. I guess that's one of the challenges to managing forests. Yeah. We'd have to get that funding somehow.
We have another comment. I totally get where you're coming from. However, when we have had ungulates breach the fence, we immediately see browsing on our most vulnerable native species, pep plants and recent outplantings. But as you mentioned, it's site-specific and these would need to be evaluated.
Yeah, and we're not saying not to fence. I think we should still fence everything we possibly can fence. So we're still going to have the fences, still need the fences, still need those as preserves for rare plants. I think this is meant to be for like the areas that'll never be fenced. So yeah, I totally agree. Like we see that too. They love to hammer certain really rare plants, which is a bummer.
Great. We're going to move on now to the next presentation. We still have some questions in the Q&A and I think also in the chat. So if you want to answer them there, please do. And again, stick around, folks, for the end of the session where we'll have more time to discuss as a group. We're going to now move to Carmen Antaki, who is going to present on the path to registering a toxic bait for small Indian mongoose. Take it away, Carmen.
Thank you, Melissa. I'm unmuted now. Okay, I'm going to start sharing, but it says cannot